I want you to follow me very closely now, because I'm bringing this all down to the tip of the funnel here, the lower end of it. What is the resurrection all about? How do we know that it really happened? See, once upon a time, the swoon theory, the hallucination theory, the fraud theory, and the stolen body theory, all of that took their turns and made their rounds. Swoon theory that changed the disciples from a bunch of frightened Boy Scouts, as it were, to be willing to be martyrs, where 11 out of the 12 died a martyr's death. Hallucination, where psychiatrists will tell you hallucination is sort of a single individual's experience, not with 500 of them hallucinating at the same time. As Karl Barth said, all you need to do is listen to them arguing against each other, and they decimate each other's arguments. Barth was right in that. I want to give you what classic arguments are given, 10 of them, for the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And I will close by adding 2 more links to that. So here they are. Number 1, the disciples' eyewitness experience, where they saw and felt and touched. They saw, felt, and touched. I come from India. My father was from Kerala. My mother was from Chennai. I was raised in Delhi. Kerala is in the deep south, Delhi is in the north. Kerala has a little town called Kodungalur. It is the place where the Apostle Thomas first set foot on Indian soil. There is a huge amount of extra biblical material available on this. I researched it, I picked it up from people like the Venerable Bede to other well-known patristic fathers and so on who testify to Thomas going there. The oldest church in India is called the Martoma Church, named after him, after Thomas. And I ask you, why would a man have done what he did and paid with his spear-thrusted side? Because he said he would not believe until he saw and felt and touched. And the eyewitness of Thomas is, as he knelt and felt that side, ho kurios mu, ho theos mu, my Lord and my God. The transformation of Thomas. Why did 11 out of the 12 disciples die a martyr's death? And by the way, Thomas Aquinas makes a vitally important point here about these martyrdoms. He said they all died alone. They died alone. This is not 12 or 50 or 60 of them in one room all of a sudden deciding to come up with a theory and a story and being gutted by flames. Peter crucified upside down. Paul stoned on the Appian Way. And here Thomas on Indian soil being speared to death. There's a memorial to his death to this very day. They died alone. They weren't looking for some great celebration on the outside and some cheering. They were murdered and slaughtered in so many different ways, and they paid for this. Think of all things of the vision of Peter, who even after seeing the transfiguration, a sight given to just 3 of them, so profound was the transfiguration experience where he said, let's stay right here. I don't want to leave here. Even after that, he went on and denied his Lord. Then he says, but now we have the word of the prophets made more certain, and you will do well to heed that as a light in a dark place. What's happened to Peter is a remarkable transformation. And I suggest to you that he saw Moses. He saw Elijah. It took the resurrected Christ to transform this man. So number 1, you see the disciples as eyewitnesses. Number 2, the early proclamation of the resurrection. So powerful. These documents are so powerful. You know, a few years ago, I was in Tirana in Albania. I just finished speaking at the parliament and then spent about an hour with President Berisha. Fascinating conversation, which I won't betray to you. But after that, the curator of the museum said, I really want you to come to the museum, please. I said, I'm very tired this afternoon. I've got to do an open forum at your university. He said, please come. I'll give you something as a treat you'll never forget in your life. I promise you. And I was a guest, and I told my videographer, Bob, I said, why don't you go with me? I'm tired, but let's go. We went, and they were surrounded by all kinds of militia. I wondered where we'd come. And I walked into the room, all guards around the room, and people packing an auditorium. And he takes me in, and he introduces me in their language, and then he turns to me in English and says, will you please repeat the message you gave to the members of parliament this morning? So I looked at him and said, I thought you were going to give me a surprise and a treat I'd never forget. He said, it'll come, just speak. I did it in about 20 minutes, and then we sat down. All of a sudden come 3 or 4 guards with their arms outstretched like that, all of them wearing blue gloves. And one man following them with blue gloves in their hand places one in front of Bob Tigert, my videographer, and myself. And they place these volumes in front of me. The 4 Gospels, written in gold ink by the hand of Saint Chrysostom in the 400s. In the 400s, Ceausescu tried to burn them. Somebody hid them. And what you ended up as a result, preserved, perfect, perfectly justified. Why did men like that preserve these documents, willing to risk their entire life for you and for me? The early proclamation of the resurrection with the documents. 3, their transformation from fear to martyrdom is remarkable. Number 4, the empty tomb. Number 5, they proclaimed it in Jerusalem itself, where it all happened. Number 6, no contrary evidence when those would have desperately wanted to prove it wrong. All they would needed to have done is produce the body. Instead, Rome itself bent its knee to the message, the power of all that was happening. 7, the existence of the church founded by law-abiding monotheistic Jews. 8, the change of the day of worship to Sunday. 9, the conversion of James. 10, the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. Number 1, eyewitness experiences. Number 2, early proclamation of the resurrection. Number 3, transformation of the disciples from fear to martyrdom. 4, the empty tomb. 5, they proclaimed it in Jerusalem itself, right where it happened. 6, no contrary evidence when those who wanted to prove it wrong would desperately have wanted to produce it. 7, the existence of the church founded by law-abiding monotheistic Jews. 8, the change of the day of worship to Sunday. 9, the conversion of James. 10, the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. I've already spoken to you about Peter and Thomas. Can I add just one more? Why on earth would they have first put the evidence in the mouths of women? Tell me. In a society where their word would not have counted in court. So if anybody is scheming this thing up, anybody is trying to create a scenario, that would be the last place they would have gone to find authority. It's just like my Lord, who take those that the world was marginalizing, Just like my Lord on the cross, to look at the young man and point to his mother and say, take care of her. She's your mother now. And then he comes into the garden and appears to the women and says, you go and tell the disciples, and you go and tell Peter, these boys weren't ready for this kind of a primary source. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. Something else. Why would he have said he was going to bodily rise again when he could have hoodwinked them like other Eastern mystics and said, I'll spiritually rise again? How do you ever falsify something like that? How do you falsify it? Say, he's spiritually risen. He said he would bodily rise again. You know, I'm not kidding you when I tell you this. Take these 10 to 12 to 13 evidences and put it together and try and then defend the swoon theory, the fraud theory, the stolen theory. And I think Spong came up with what? Dogs ate the body, and the book came out, Spong was wrong. Anything Spong believes, I don't know where he comes up with. I think he lies in bed at night wondering, what weird idea can I come up with tomorrow morning? All these other theories. And I love what the Apostle Paul says. He says, and to me, the least of all, he says, one abnormally born. You know what he's talking about? One dragged out of the womb, unwilling to come out. And he goes and writes for us 1/3 of the New Testament and changes history as it was known then. And he says this, different to all the other disciples, that I may know him, the power of his resurrection. That I may know him, the powers of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. Follow me. Every other disciple came the other way, through the cross to the resurrection. He came the reverse way, from the resurrection to the cross, that I may know him, the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. Let me take you back. Creation, the general value of you as an essential person, the particularity of you as an individual. You see, many humans die every day. We can't mourn for all, but God gives us those special relationships. When we lose someone close to us, that particularity of that person becomes important for us to know whether the resurrection idea really is true and the fact of the resurrection is historically tenable, because then we'll see this loved one again, the hope. And then we go through the redemption, who brought the miracle of new birth into you and to me, from the miracle of creation to the miracle of the redemption to the miracle of the resurrection. Follow me carefully here. What goes on with the skeptic here? Please follow me. I don't know why I think up these things, but I do. You know, my wife and I celebrated 40 years of marriage last year. If salvation were by works, she will get to heaven just for having lived with me for 40 years. But thank God, we'll get there by grace. Here's what I want to say to you. When it comes to natural law, the skeptic invokes the natural law as an absolute and will not allow for the miracle because it's an exception. He wants the absoluteness of that which is routine, repetitive, and will deny anything that is an exception because it invades his preconceived notions. So he holds on to the absolute in the created order and denies the miracle because it's an exception. When it comes to moral reasoning, he reverses that. He takes the exception in order to argue against what's normative. That alone ought to tell you what these boys are all about. They want an end game in sight. They want to get to the end without God. And so when it's convenient, they'll hold on to an exception. When it's inconvenient, they will deny an exception. So in the created order, they hold on to the absolute, deny the exception. On moral reasoning, they hold on to the exception to deny the absolute. That's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. I was with a professor of law of a very prestigious university. I'll close with that, end up with a couple of illustrations here, and I'll be through. If I named him or the position he held, all of you will know whom I'm talking about. But I was having coffee with him for 1 hour, total skeptic, before I lectured. This is not long ago. He said, you know, Ravi, when I was young, I had all the aspirations, and I was very conservative in my thinking, my values, my beliefs. Then I got into university and got everything the way I wanted it to go. And I became extremely liberal and jettisoned all my absolutes. And I became the chief legal counselor, and he named the person for whom he was the legal counsel. He said, you and I are sitting across this table now. You're in your 60s. I'm approaching 70. He said, I'm back to my conservative way of thinking, and wondered where all the years went that I squandered in debunking absolutes and debunking all those notions. He said, you know, friend, I want to tell you something. If there is an answer, I'm coming more and more to the conviction it'll have to be in Jesus Christ. I know of no other. He writes to me, he writes to my colleague in Oxford, John Lennox. Why? Why? I'm now a grandfather. We have one little grandson. I spoke to him on the phone today. He's 19 months old. Hi, Papa. Hi, Papa. Hi, Papa. It costs $0.50 to just keep listening to that, but it's fun. And I watch him walking around and I think to myself, why am I enjoying this so much? I had 3. What's the difference? I think there's a difference. You know what the difference is? You have a stock of emotional energy available at any given day. When you have your own, you're spending all of that in care, responsibility, worry, provision, all that kind of stuff. You've got very little left to really enjoy it. Now, when it comes second time around, somebody else is spending all the emotional energy on running around doing this and this. You've got all of this energy to enjoy it. When he was born, I happened to literally arrive as she was being taken to the hospital. I got to the hospital and saw the first sight of the baby coming and being placed on the mother's breast, my little daughter Naomi, and the husband Drew standing there. I'll never forget it. You look at the life and you say, wow, how precious, how particular. And the nurse comes and sits down and goes through everything, and she says, now Naomi, you got a bracelet on your wrist. Jude's got a bracelet on his wrist. If anybody takes that baby away from this floor, as soon as they get onto the elevator to go to another floor, you'll hear an alarm ring in your room, we'll hear one ring in our office. And my daughter's face fell. The glory of a new life was suddenly dimmed by the tragedy of depraved human behavior. And one day, we'll all come to that moment of being called home. And the Apostle Paul says, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall all not sleep, but we shall all be changed at the moment, the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. I close with these 2 little illustrations that I hope will be meaningful for you. A few years ago, my father-in-law, Lindsay Reynolds, passed away. He was one of the most amazing men that I knew. He was really like a dad to me. He was a chemical engineer by training, brilliant man, loved the hymns. From the moment he found he had cancer till he died, it was 4 months. Shock. And I went and spent time with him. My wife, Margie, we spent a lot of time with him. I loved my father-in-law very much. He always called me Ravioli. He never had a son. And I went and sat down and held his hand, and we chatted of all the great things. And he said, I'm so sorry, son, this has come so suddenly, and so on. I had to go away for some meetings, and the day he was going, he'd been silent for a few days. He was 85. Been married 63 years, I believe. He'd been silent, shriveled down to a bag of bones. Didn't say a word. Then his eyes opened. 3 of his 4 daughters around the bed, his wife around the bed there. They all said this. He opened his eyes, looked to the heavens, and he said the word, amazing. That's amazing. Then he looked at his wife and said, Jean, I love you. And he was gone. Jean, I love you. And he was gone. What a way to say goodbye to this world. The glory and amazement of what you see, and bidding goodbye for having honored the love of your life. All of this only makes sense if you are created by God, if you're redeemed by Him, and ultimately resurrected for a future hope. And so the songwriter says, but just think of stepping on shore and finding it heaven, of touching a hand and finding it God's, of breathing new air and finding it celestial, of waking up in glory and finding it home. As a traveling man, no word means more to me as an abstract sounding word, but with all the concrete reality as the word home. You see, C.S. Lewis is right. You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body. That is the hope that God gives to you and to me. And so the 3 links, the miracle of creation, the miracle of redemption, and the miracle of the resurrection. You know who knew it best? Lazarus. You can go to Larnaca today and see his grave. He became a bishop there. Do you know what it says on his grave? Lazarus, Bishop of Larnaca, twice dead, friend of Jesus. I'm glad he's not just your friend and mine, he's also our Savior. And as a friend of mine used to say, if we don't see you in the future, we'll see you in the pasture. God bless you.